In this video, I want to go through the outcomes of globalization for the developed world. By the developed world, I'm talking about the more developed economies such as the USA and America, with special reference to Margaret Thatcher and the effect that globalization had in the UK under her government in around the 1980s time, and the more longer term impact on leaders such as President Obama in America. So the main impact of globalization in the developed economy is deindustrialization and hence structural unemployment. And this can be best illustrated through the London Docklands in London, UK. So between 1961 and 1971, approximately 83,000 jobs were lost in the 5 boroughs of the Docklands. So as a result of globalization, a large amount of industries basically outsourced their jobs to developing countries. Examples include the Ford factory, Ford making cars, and the Hoover factory, Hoover company. They moved around 11,000 jobs off to China and India and countries like that. This led to underutilised resources in the economy. The factor of production labour isn't being used up. There's people who aren't working, so they aren't producing everything that the economy is capable of doing, so there's a negative output gap there. And until the economy evolved, so around the 1980s the economy started to evolve and we started to get investment banks propping up in the London Docklands area, there was a large amount of underutilised resources, and the long run aggregate supply of the economy actually contracted. It went inwards because not everyone who was able to work were working, so the negative output gap basically grew. Unemployment also grew as a result, and GDP growth in that area began to fall. So, whereas the impacts in the short term on the UK were fairly negative, we had deindustrialisation, we had a lot of structural unemployment, it could be argued that in the long term the impacts are actually quite beneficial. It's linking back to this example of the London Docklands here. Average salary in the London Docklands is now £100,000, so whereas a lot of jobs were lost through globalisation, the economy has actually begun to transform through government initiatives, and then banks have propped up in the area. That's quite beneficial for the UK because as average earnings rise, the government gets more tax revenue and they can spend that on redistributing wealth, etc. So you could argue that in the long term, the London Docklands, they've gained greatly. Approximately all jobs lost, all manufacturing jobs lost in the 1960s and 70s have been replaced by those in the service sector. So in the short term, a lot of jobs were lost, but in the long term we can see a process of evolution going on and the economy improving. A bit of evaluation here, you've got to consider who gets the jobs. There are clearly winners and losers in this situation within the UK. So the winners are effectively those who have the skills to go and do these jobs because their salaries rise. But a clear disadvantage, or the losers of globalisation within the UK, is those on the cargo ships working in these docks, because as you can imagine, it's unlikely that somebody who had the skills to go work in a cargo is now going to go get a job in an investment bank. So clearly there are winners who go and get those more skilled jobs, and there are losers in that some people don't have the skills to go into another job, and that's known as the hysteresis effect, where they lose their skills after a while. As a result of this, however, inequality has actually risen since the rise of Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s and the evolution of the economy. So, typically, as we saw in the last sort of screen, there is more demand for skilled workers now. As you saw, the banks in the London Docklands have risen and incomes have risen also in that area. So the more skilled workers, those who work in the banks, those who have the more skilled services sector jobs, they actually get a higher income because there's more demand for those people in those jobs, basic supply and demand. And then the lower skilled workers, those in the cargo, sort of manufacturing type jobs, their incomes actually depreciate because there is lower demand for those. So hence inequality on disposable income, that's income after it's been taxed, actually rises, and therefore we have equity concerns, what's fair in the economy. If inequality rises, is that necessarily fair? That's a key market failure question that you should be considering there.